The dynamic center of capitalism has moved from the West to the East. It seems to me the evidence now is literally overwhelming. I know there are plenty of people who don't want to see it, but I really do now write that off to what is typical of declining empires, that the people who run them don't want to see them decline, which I understand, are frightened by the prospect of decline, which I understand, and so do something which I understand, which is to pretend it isn't happening. And this is exactly how empires die. Not from weakness, but from denial. When reality changes, they cling to nostalgia. The world has already shifted east. Capital, manufacturing, growth, ambition. Yet leaders in the West are still acting like they're the center of gravity. They're fighting decline, not with strategy, but with ego. They would rather live in a fantasy than adapt to a new world. And when pride becomes policy, collapse becomes inevitable. We are still certainly a capitalist country. But it isn't the dynamic center. It isn't where the technological breakthroughs are stunning and build on each other. It isn't the growth area. It isn't the market expansion. It's basically none of those things. It has a few remaining dynamic sectors. High-tech in California is one of them, and so on. But the bulk of the dynamic of capitalist growth, technical growth of output, growth of trade, that's moved east. That's now somewhere else. And it is the gap, as you know. You and I have discussed it. If you add up the GDPs of the G7, they were roughly equal to the GDP of China and the BRICS in the year 2020. And here we are, almost 6 years later, and the gap gets wider each year in the favor of the East, not the West. So capitalism is in a declining situation in the West. I would argue worse in Europe than in the United States. But whichever one of those, the dynamic, the growth, the expansion that has gone to the East, and you see the symptoms in our culture here, literally every day, because once growth leaves, confidence leaves. The West still talks like it's leading, while the East is actually building. We kept the brand of capitalism. They took the engine. And that's why every year the gap grows and we shrink.
The concern isn't just
the shock
cost,
that United States plus Europe arming Ukraine over a 10-year period was, and funding it and weaponizing it in every way, was insufficient to defeat the Russians.
And that requires
this
more
is
than
a terrible, terrible issue for them. Not because they care all that much where the boundaries are. They lived for decades with NATO blocked by Eastern Europe when it was part of the Soviet system. They can live with a reduced NATO boundary. This is not a serious issue, right? And their concern for invading small countries is so laughable that you have a hard time when otherwise serious people talk like that. United States invaded Vietnam, rich, big, powerful country, poor, little country. And all of these people didn't say anything. And then the United States invaded Afghanistan, even poorer, and nobody small. You know, big country invades little country. Then Iraq. I mean, this is silly. We're about to do something in Venezuela, which is what? It's an exercise in make-believe. It's an exercise in affirming when you're frightened that the Monroe Doctrine is still, the law of the world, and that the United States is there to enforce it. And two, but it is so desperate because this was never about defending anyone. It was about proving they still run the world. When power slips, insecurity takes over. That's why every setback turns into another intervention. They aren't fighting wars, they're fighting irrelevance. And the harder they push to look strong, the more the unquestioned dominance is over. I don't know how this is played out in the European press, but I know the United States, and there have now been at least 60 to 65 people. I keep some record that have been killed in these boats, partly in the Caribbean, partly on the Pacific Ocean side of Latin America. No evidence. None. Zero. No lawyer, no jury, no judge, nothing. Summary execution by the American military. And for those who are watching this program and do not know American law, we have a terrible drug problem in this country. But we've had it for 50 years. The entirety of my life, Drugs are everywhere. I can get any of the so-called illegal drugs here in New York whenever I want. When a country starts killing without proof, that's not enforcement. That's power without restraint. The drug crisis is just the excuse. If 50 years of the same strategy hasn't solved it, then the goal was never to solve it. It was to justify force. Employment looking bad? Inflation not going down? Worried that the tariffs, which really haven't hit yet, are in the process of being transformed into higher retail prices. Goldman Sachs and others are out with the studies. As predicted, the importers. These boats partly in the Caribbean, partly on the Pacific Ocean side of Latin America. No evidence. None. Zero. No lawyer, no jury, no judge, nothing. Summary execution by the American military. And for those who are watching this program and do not know American law, we have a terrible drug problem in this country. But we've had it for 50 years. The entirety of my life, drugs are everywhere. I can get any of the so-called illegal drugs here in New York whenever I want. When a country starts killing without proof, that's not enforcement. That's power without restraint. The drug crisis is just the excuse. If 50 years of the same strategy hasn't solved it, then the goal was never to solve it. It was to justify force. Employment looking bad? Inflation not going down? Worried that the tariffs, which really haven't hit yet, are in the process of being transformed into higher retail prices. Goldman Sachs and others are out with the studies. As predicted, the importers. The American businesses who import, those are the ones who pay the tariff, by the way. And notice, Americans, starting with Mr. Trump, continue to speak in a very carefully choreographed confusion. If you listen closely, tariffs are presented as a punishment for other countries. They have cheated us. They have, fooled with us. Balance of payments data are abused in order to make that case. And so we're going to punish them with a tariff. Most Americans, my students, I teach economics. It's a subject we teach. I have to explain to my students who don't understand, having learned that tariff is a tax imposed by the U.S. government on U.S. citizens, since the U.S. government cannot impose taxes on other people's citizens. And this is the trick. They sell tariffs as punishment for other countries, but the bill lands on American consumers. Businesses don't absorb that cost. They pass it straight to the price tag. So inflation doesn't slow down, it accelerates. While politicians talk about making them pay, the reality is simple. Tariffs are just taxes with a patriotic slogan slapped on top. It's economic theater. Confusion on purpose. When leadership needs someone to blame for their own failures, they point to foreign villains, not their own policies. Mr. Trump is believed by at least a third of his followers to be vulnerable to what is finally going to come out around the Epstein case. He will lose large numbers of people because of it. Everybody believes that. I don't know if it's true, but everybody believes it. So you and he lost the election. That cannot strengthen him inside the Republicans. There are a dozen people around him who want to displace him and take his job. So you have a disintegration at multiple levels in a society whose empire is vanishing and who faces a recession any day now, becoming so big and strong that it isn't only commented on in the financial press, but on the whole general public. This is what happens when power starts being. Allies turn into competitor overnight. The perception of vulnerability is enough to weaken a leader even before anything is proven. Add an election loss, internal rivals circling, and an economy sliding toward recession. And the collapse doesn't come from outside forces. It starts from within. It's interesting, though, that with the economic decline, when you see, the political system disintegrate a bit, new battle lines obviously must be drawn. And this will always entail defining who we are versus the other, which you kind of made a point how this is changing both in the Democratic Party and the Republican. But what is interesting with the US, though, is it's been often quite unique in terms of having a very positive nationalism, because it's always assumption that it's best days ahead of it. Because since the colonies on the East Coast, going to the West, you have bipolar era uniolar. It's always been going from strength to strength. But now that it's seeing decline, then this opened us up for the more negative nationalism. We have more of that in Europe, I guess, where you look back at a glorious past, which is now gone, and you look who to blame. And of course, you see this now popping up in the US as well. That is, ideally, for US unity, just blame China and go into a new Cold War. We use the word ideally, careful here. It's not a great future either. When a nation stops believing in its future, nationalism turns into blame. Instead of building, they look for someone to attack. And when leaders can't offer progress, they offer an enemy. China becomes the distraction from decline. It just seems to me, though, the Europeans, they are hoping that the battle lines would be shifted in a way which we end up on the American side, because it's also interesting that Trump points to the EU, for example, as one of the people or the worse than the Chinese in terms. And it is interesting that, before you asked, you're not sure how the Venezuelan issue is covered in the European media. But it does appear to me that the Europeans, they don't really mind the idea of the US ceasing control of the Venezuelan assets, especially because, they're having too close relations with the Chinese and Russians. But they hope that this will be in the format of the political West, which is why I think, for example, the Nobel Peace Prize, it was almost a layup for Trump. That is, listen, here's the opposition, she wants the government toppled. But this is in the name of liberal democracy. So if you do it in the name of liberal hedge, promote democracy, then that's the shared identity of the political West. But Trump instead went for narrow terrorism, so more American hard security. So I think they don't mind the destruction of Venezuela as long as this is, we are on the side of America in these battle lines, and instead we see outside. But do you see the US distancing itself from Europe? Or just how's the relationship shifting, you think, during this political decline? And when I say America, I do realize you have different political forces. Europe isn't choosing morality, it's choosing survival. If the US crushes Venezuela, Europe just wants to make sure they're standing on the winning side. The problem is, America isn't leading a coalition anymore. It's acting alone, and that's the real shift. The US isn't pulling Europe closer, it's drifting away. What used to be partnership is becoming convenience. When an empire declines, allies stop being allies. They become spectators. Yes, and I want to put my cards on the table. I'm a critic both of capitalism in general and of American capitalism. And I believe it's a healthy society that has critics. And every system always has had them. Whether you silence them for a while, but they're always there. So I come from a critical perspective, and I don't have many special knowledge. And I know many of the people who run the government, because the United States, contrary to the liberal democratic nonsense, is a highly stratified, prestige-ridden society. So, you're talking to someone like me, comes out of my education was at Harvard, at Stanford, and Yale. If you have that, for 10 years of my life, I got all the degrees I have in these institutions, My classmate in my economics program was, interesting. I block her name, Janet Yellen, right? So then, my classmate and one of my teachers at Harvard was Henry Kissinger, etc., etc., etc. So I know I come out of that education with that part of the population, and that's the closest I come. I don't remain friends with these people, so I read the newspaper like everybody else. But here's what I would argue is going on economically. A number of places, but I'm going to start at one because it's very dramatic and it sits in a very prominent place in their minds. We have gone in a relatively short number of years from a country with a relatively small national debt to a country with a very large national, from a few $100 billion a few decades ago to 35 trillion, or whatever exactly it is right now. It is so bad that along the way, we lost our AAA credit rating from Standard & Poor, Moody's, and Fitch, the three great creating credit agencies in the world, which are all American, have all demoted the creditworthiness of the United States. There are other countries that have AAA. We're not one of them. And that's the irony. The people warning about America's decline aren't outsiders. They're insiders who saw how the system was built and now see how fast it's unraveling. When a nation loses its AAA credit rating, it's not just an economic event. It's a verdict. Debt isn't the problem. Denial is. Because once a country starts borrowing just to maintain the illusion of strength, collapse isn't sudden. It's slow, silent, and self-inflicted.